Every one of us has a story. We all have a beginning, and somewhere along the way, we become the person we are today. Most of us remember our lives in pieces. A birthday, a first day at school, a first kiss, a new job. But there is so much more to a life than the moments we remember most. There are thousands of ordinary days in between, through many years later. My name is John Douglas Pritchard. I was born in 1965, and I've now lived more than 60 years on this earth. I've been a son, a brother, a husband, a musician, a businessman, a taxi driver, an author, a songwriter. I've succeeded, I've failed, I've loved, I've lost. Moments of incredible happiness and periods of my life I wasn't sure I would make it through. And through all of it, I kept moving forward. Over the years, I began looking back. I began reconstructing my life. The addresses where I lived, the schools I attended, the jobs I worked, the relationships I had, the music I made. And slowly, something remarkable began to happen. I started seeing my life differently. Patterns started appearing. One chapter of my life had influenced another. I couldn't tell it only through the big moments, the places where different versions of me once existed. The homes, the neighborhoods, the people, the memories. I'm going to take you through my life the way I experienced it, one address at a time. Some chapters will be happy, some will be funny, some will be difficult, but I'm going to tell them as honestly as I can. I'm doing this partly so that my story will still exist when I'm no longer here. For my family, for the people who have known me, and perhaps for people who haven't met me at all. Because somewhere within my story, you may recognize a piece of your own. And maybe you'll find yourself looking back at your own life a little differently. But before we can understand where a life eventually leads, we have to understand where it began. So, let's go back to the beginning. Toronto, Ontario, 1965. This is where my story begins. On April 25th, 1965, at 3:28 in the morning, I was born at Humber Memorial Hospital in Weston, Ontario. I weighed 8 pounds 5 ounces, but the hospital wasn't home. The first address on the timeline of my life was 9 Rest Ever Gate in Etobicoke, Ontario. This is me just a few days later, leaving the hospital in my mother's arms and heading home for the very first time. One of my earliest photographs shows me at home with my father. Here's another picture showing my father and I sitting at the lake together. Look how young I am. There I am, sitting in a chair with that big smile on my face, and then celebrating Christmas with my mother. Before long, our family moved to 17 Ramley Road, the next address in my story. By then, I was the youngest of 5 children. That's me on the far left, followed by my sisters Sandra, Susan, and Sherry, and my stepbrother Randy on the far right, who would later change his name to Jason. And as I grew from a baby into a little boy, the photographs begin to capture more of the person I was becoming. Soon these photographs would be joined by something else, my own memories. There were birthday parties, and apparently I was already learning how to flirt with Patricia. At the cottage, while everyone else was having fun, there I was sitting by myself on the concrete septic tank, apparently pondering the meaning of life. And at Fantasy Island in Buffalo, New York, I discovered what it felt like to be a giant, towering over an entire miniature town. Looking back at Ramley Road now, I can see an entire little world that once belonged to me. The houses, the backyards, the neighborhood friends, the places where we played, all of it contained within just a few streets. There were a lot of wonderful memories made here, but eventually it was time to leave this neighborhood behind and move on to the next chapter of my life. And so we left St. Catharines behind and began again. Our new home was 44 Dawson Crescent in Georgetown, Ontario. I would spend the next 6 years of my life in this house, a significant part of my childhood. And unlike those earliest years, this is where many of my own memories begin to become much clearer. While we were living on Dawson Crescent, I began attending Harrison Public School. These are my class pictures from grades 1, 2, and 3, the early school years, when life was still pretty simple. Each year brought a new classroom, a new teacher, new classmates, and another step through childhood. Sometime during those early school years, my parents sent me away to a Christian summer camp for a month. But camp also gave me an opportunity to discover something new. I learned about photography, and one evening I took a photograph of a beautiful sunset. I must have done something right because my father loved that photograph. He took it to work and kept it on his desk for years. Of all the things I remember about that month away, knowing that something I created meant enough to my father for him to keep it beside him all those years is the part that stayed with me. One day we paddled out to an island where we were going to spend the night. Then the rain came. We didn't have cabins waiting for us, so we turned the canoes over and slept underneath them for shelter. There were also family trips to visit my grandparents, and during one of those visits, my father took me fishing. I still have this photograph of the two of us sitting together on the rocks by the water. There were ordinary family moments too. Christmas mornings at home, presents around the tree, and time spent with my dad. At the time, they were simply moments in a childhood. Decades later, photographs like these have become pieces of a life I'm grateful were preserved. Dawson Crescent became the backdrop to so much of my childhood. There were birthdays at home, surrounded by my sisters and friends, opening presents around the fireplace. And of course, no birthday was complete without a cake. That's David on one side of me and Jeff on the other, waiting for me to blow out the candles. We had a swimming pool in the backyard, and some of my favorite summer memories were made there. Swimming with my mother, learning to go underwater, and posing for a photo in the pool with my friend Jeff. Sometimes adventure didn't require going anywhere at all. In the backyard, I had a small tent, and apparently the perfect place to lie down with a book. And then there were the neighborhood kids. Across the street lived Darren, Cindy, and Nicole. They would come over and ask my mother if the funny boy could come out to play. When I look back at those early years in Georgetown, I remember a lot of good things. Family, friends, birthdays, summers in the pool, and the freedom of simply being a kid. I was also a member of the Cubs, earning new scarves as I progressed, and I studied judo, competing in tournaments and working my way through the colored belts. But it wasn't all fun and games. I remember my parents driving me into Toronto quite often for different doctor's appointments. Some were for allergy testing. I remember having my back covered with tiny test spots as doctors tried to determine what I might be allergic to. But there was another part of my childhood that photographs don't really show. I wet the bed every night. My parents took me to doctors and hospitals in Toronto, searching for answers. I went through repeated examinations of my bladder and kidneys, including dye and x-rays to investigate a reflux problem. At home, they even tried a bedwetting alarm. I slept on a wire mesh placed over a plastic sheet, connected to a machine that would sound an alarm the moment it detected moisture. Night after night meant alarms, wet sheets, and more laundry. As a child, I became painfully aware that something about me was creating extra work and disturbing everyone else's sleep. Whether anyone intended it or not, I began to feel different from the rest of my family. Embarrassed, singled out, and ashamed of something I couldn't seem to control. But childhood can change very quickly. And in 1976, mine did. I was 10 years old when I entered grade 5. The man who became my teacher that year would sexually abuse me repeatedly throughout the school year. I didn't understand what was happening to me. I only knew that something had changed. Fear, confusion, and shame had entered a childhood where they did not belong. That summer, the effects of grade 5 were already beginning to show. I had fallen behind in school, and I remember being given work to complete over the summer. My sister Susan would sit with me in the backyard and try to help me understand it, but concentrating wasn't easy anymore. I was there physically, but inside I was somewhere else, confused, withdrawn, and trying to make sense of emotions I didn't understand. Little by little, I was beginning to retreat from the world around me and disappear into my own thoughts. Sometimes I would take whiskey from my father's bar and disappear into the ravine by myself. I was only a kid, sitting alone and drinking while I tried to make sense of my life and everything that had happened to me. I didn't have the words for any of it then. I only knew that being alone somehow felt easier than being part of the world around me. Grade 6 was my final school year in Ontario. I attended Centennial, closer to home, so at least the walk wasn't as far. But by then, I wasn't the same kid anymore, and it showed. I'm not even in this class photo. At the bottom, I'm listed as absent. I had started skipping classes, getting into trouble, and withdrawing further from the life I'd once known. My father had built a successful career in municipal government. Here he was being appointed clerk administrator for the newly formed town of Halton Hills. Then 6 years later, another opportunity came, this time much farther from home. My father accepted a position as city administrator in Penticton, British Columbia. And just like that, we were leaving Ontario behind, traveling more than 3,000 kilometers across Canada to begin a new life in British Columbia. But while we were moving forward, I was carrying something with me that I still couldn't leave behind. Our first stop in Penticton was the Spanish Villa Motel, a temporary home while my parents got settled and we prepared to begin our new life in British Columbia. Ontario was now more than 3,000 kilometers behind me. Everything familiar was gone, and once again, I was the new kid in a place where I knew no one. While we stayed at the Spanish Villa, I spent a lot of time swimming in the indoor pool. Outside, everything about Penticton felt different. The mountains, Okanagan Lake, and the beautiful beach right across the street from the motel. Not far away were the tennis courts, where I'd spend time hitting a ball against the practice board on the fence, playing by myself for as long as I wanted. It didn't take me long to start making friends. Somehow, I always seemed to find the rowdier crowd, boys and girls who lived in the motels along the lakeshore or in apartments nearby. Eventually, I discovered Wizards, an arcade downtown where a lot of the misfit kids seemed to spend their days and nights. At first, to me, it was just somewhere to hang out. Later, I learned there was more going on there, including drugs being sold. Eventually, my family found a house to rent on Edna Avenue. Next door lived the Vass family, and I became friends with their sons, Ron and Larry. Their family owned a trailer that I remember being used during the filming of a television movie starring Shirley Jones. I even ended up with her autograph. The movie, as I remember it now, was Who'll Save Our Children? While we were living on Edna Avenue, I broke into my father's liquor cabinet. I was only 12. A friend was over, his brother joined us, and the three of us drank as much of my father's booze as we could. My sister Sandra knew what we were doing and threatened to tell our parents. They would have found out anyway, but in that moment I became furious. I lashed out and punched her in the face. Looking back, it was another sign that something inside me was changing. I was drinking, getting into trouble, and reacting with an anger I didn't know how to deal with. After that incident, my parents took me to see a doctor. He recommended that I be sent to a center for troubled kids. From the outside, I suppose it looked like I was becoming a problem. Drinking, fighting, skipping school, and acting out. And now there were consequences. After that incident, my parents took me to see a doctor. He recommended that I be sent to a center for troubled kids. But from where I stood, it felt like I was being punished. What I really needed was help. I remember sitting there looking out the window as my parents got into their car. I watched them pull out of the parking lot and drive away until I couldn't see them anymore. I was 14 years old, and in that moment, I didn't feel like a kid who was being sent somewhere to get help. I felt abandoned from my own family. It wasn't long before I started going AWOL from the center. I would run away and hitchhike, sometimes trying to make it all the way to Vancouver. On one attempt, I was caught in Headley and brought back. And when you broke the rules at the center, there were consequences. One of them was isolation in a padded room. The first punishment could be 24 hours, then 36. The maximum was 72 hours. I got 72. For most of the day, there was nothing in that room. At mealtimes, they brought in a tray of food and something to drink. About 20 minutes later, the tray disappeared again, whether I'd eaten or not. At night, they brought in a cot. The lights went out at 10, leaving me alone in complete darkness until morning. Then the cot was removed, and once again there was nothing. Just me in that empty room. 3 days later, the door finally opened, and I was returned to the general population. 6 months went by. During that time, I went AWOL more than once, still trying to escape a place I never wanted to be. But instead, it was decided that I would move into the brand new Flora Essen house, a group home. I remember being shocked. I wasn't going home. Once again, I found myself in another unfamiliar room, looking out another window, wondering when I would finally be allowed to go home. 6 months at the center, and instead of going home, I was being moved somewhere else. Another room, another bed, more people I didn't know. Once again, someone else was deciding where I belonged, and I was expected to simply accept it. I became close friends with Bob and Ben. We spent hours in Bob's room listening to records, smoking cigarettes, and talking about music and life. Music had always been an escape for me, and once again, it gave me somewhere else to go without actually going anywhere. Upstairs, there was a pool table overlooking the living and dining areas below. We spent a lot of our free time up here playing pool. For a while, this became one of the places where I could relax, hang out with the other guys, and almost forget that I was living in a group home. Bob and I would go to the drive-in and sit right up near the front on inflatable mattresses we brought with us. We'd smoke some weed, sneak in a little booze, and watch scary movies. Sometimes double features that had us walking back to the group home pretty late at night. Those were good times. We were just teenagers having fun. That summer, Bob and I went camping with our group home parents. One day, we took the canoe through some tall grass along the water, and fish started jumping right into the canoe. We thought we'd hit the jackpot. We had no idea they were carp, and weren't exactly the dinner we thought we'd caught. And then there was breakfast. Someone had the brilliant idea of microwaving eggs, still in their shells. Bob and I sat down and started opening them. And boom, the damn things exploded everywhere. Egg in our hair, on our faces, all over the table. We certainly learned something that morning. Never microwave an egg in its shell. Eventually, I sat down with my parents, Arlo, and one of the counselors to discuss my progress. I thought this might finally be it. I was going home. Instead, they recommended that I stay longer, and my parents agreed. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I stood up, told them all to fuck off, and walked straight back to my room. Around this time, I became good friends with Chris Sinclair. We spent hours listening to AC/DC and talking about putting a band together. We had these huge dreams of becoming famous, making money, and leaving all of this behind. We didn't have much of a plan, but at 15, the dream was enough. Then one day, Chris and I just took off. The plan was to hitchhike all the way to Riverton, Manitoba, where Chris was from. We figured we'd find somewhere to live, put our band together, and somehow make it all work. We had no money, no luggage, and absolutely no idea what we were doing. We were 15 years old and heading across Canada with nothing but the clothes on our backs. Along the way, Chris and I made it to Gull Lake, Saskatchewan. With nowhere to stay and hardly anything to our names, we found an abandoned train station and slept there for the night. Two 15-year-old kids halfway across the country sleeping in an empty railway station. Somehow at the time, it all just seemed like part of the adventure. About 100 miles outside Brandon, a man picked us up and offered us a ride. At first, he seemed friendly. During a stop along the highway, he opened the trunk of his car and showed us some liquor. That was also when Chris and I noticed a sawed-off shotgun in the trunk. He eventually took us to his home, gave us $20 each, cooked us hamburgers, and let us play air hockey. He even took a few Polaroid pictures of us. He offered to let us stay the night and said he would take us back to the highway the next morning. Later, I walked to a nearby plaza to buy cigarettes. When I returned, Chris was extremely uncomfortable and told me something had happened while I was gone. He wanted to leave immediately. The man agreed to drive us back toward the highway, but during the drive, he behaved inappropriately toward me. Chris realized what was happening and reacted. the situation escalated very quickly. The car left the road and ended up driving through a field before finally stopping. When the man got out and started moving toward the trunk, Chris and I both remembered the shotgun. We defended ourselves, got away from the situation, and made our way back toward the highway. It was late, traffic was sparse, and eventually we reached a truck stop where we began asking drivers for a ride. Not long after that, our journey would come to an abrupt end in Brandon. We never made it to Riverton. By the time we reached Brandon, things had gone completely off the rails. Chris was so drunk he could barely function. I was sitting beside the highway with him passed out against me when a police cruiser pulled up. Our adventure across Canada had just come to an end. After the police picked us up in Brandon, Chris and I were sent to Winnipeg and placed in Seven Oaks Youth Detention Center. I had no identification, and I wasn't telling anyone who I was or where I came from. As far as they were concerned, I was just another runaway kid. So they locked me up. Chris and I were separated and put into different cells. I shared mine with another boy about my age who I didn't know. There wasn't much in there, just two beds and this tiny window high on the wall. I had to stand on my tiptoes just to look outside, and all I could see was a yard surrounded by tall fences and barbed wire. I remember thinking, how the hell did I end up here? After a few weeks, they finally figured out who I was and contacted my parents. Once they learned who my father was, suddenly everything changed. Instead of being sent back by bus, I was put on a plane and flown back to Kelowna. Sitting there looking out that window, I knew one thing for certain. I was finally going home. My parents were waiting for me at the Kelowna airport. They apologized for ever putting me into the center in the group home and promised me I wasn't going back. They put me in the car and drove me straight home. After everything that had happened, those were the words I'd been waiting a very long time to hear. I was finally going home. And there it was, home. After the center, the group home, running away, hitchhiking across 3 provinces, being picked up by police, and spending weeks locked up in Winnipeg, I was back where I had wanted to be all along, home with my family. And this time, nobody was taking me back. Being back in my own room felt almost strange at first. After months of being told where to sleep and where I belonged, I finally had my own space again. But life wasn't about to stand still for very long. Before I knew it, I was packing again, and another chapter of my life was about to begin. Now that I was home, it was time to start moving forward. I got myself a job working at a local restaurant. It wasn't glamorous, but I was earning my own money, meeting new people, and beginning to feel like I had some control over my life again. After everything I'd been through, that felt pretty damn good. Not long after I came home, my parents planned a family trip to Disneyland. After everything I'd been through, I was more than ready for something completely different. California, sunshine, and Disneyland. For once, life was starting to feel normal again. And Disneyland wasn't the only stop. We also went to Universal Studios. For a kid who loved movies, music, and anything creative, seeing how movies were actually made was fascinating. For a little while, I could forget about everything that had happened and just enjoy being a kid again. We also spent a day at Knott's Berry Farm, Disneyland, Universal Studios, Knott's. After everything that had happened over the previous year, this trip gave me a chance to just have some fun. For a little while, there were no counselors, no institutions, and no locked doors. I was simply a teenager on vacation with my family. This is only the beginning. My story continues in episode 2.